Welcome to Rates and Barrels. It is Thursday, March 24th. Derek Van Riper here with Eno the king of waffles. That came all the way back on the 3-0 show this week, so I think we're going to stick with that on the screen on YouTube for just a little while longer. Plus, waffles are such a fun food anyway. They're a good symbolic food for you anyway,
We've been ever since you gave us that waffle maker, that waffle iron. We've been making a lot more waffles. I've gotten good at it. The key is to make it thin. The batter should be thin.
Yes. The other key is to not fill the entire waffle iron with batter. Like leave a little bit around the edges so you get these kind of clean up for one, and also the shape of the waffles comes out more craggly, and I think that's kind of fun and gives you a little extra texture as well. So your waffle tips for the day are already in the books in the first minute of the podcast. A couple things I want to point out right up top. There is a bracket going on. We are in the finals. It is the Baseball Pods bracket at Baseball Pods on Twitter.
We won last year, but we're losing in the finals this year.
We are currently losing, and I think voting closes sometime around 8 or 9 o'clock Eastern on Thursday, the day this podcast is being released. So if you happen to hear this episode as soon as it drops and you haven't voted for us already and you do like our podcast just as much, if not more, than the CBS Sports Today Fantasy Baseball podcast, we'd appreciate your vote. But thank you to anybody who's voted for us along the way. And also be sure to check out the other shows throughout the bracket, because I think it's a great tool to discover new podcasts. I think one of my pet peeves as someone who makes audio content is that it's very difficult to find new things that you might like. The algorithms tend to favor established shows that have been around for a little while, and discovery is like a broader podcast sort of problem. And I think this is one of those events that highlights a lot of great new shows that you've maybe even never heard of before, or at least haven't had a chance to listen to yet. So be sure to explore the bracket once you get a chance to do that.
I'd like to think we're like Mike Trout or Willie Mays, where we're just obviously the best, but there's some fatigue and people just don't want to give it to us every year. I'm just kidding. I love you guys. Thanks for listening. And if we lose, they're a great pod. And we had a tough battle against Sleeper in the Bus, which I hate that they put us in the same bracket a lot of times, because those are our guys too. So.
Yeah, I think we caught RotoWire in the bracket last year. It's strange to go up against so many people that are legitimately your friends, or at least are podcasts that you worked on before, or both. Very odd,
right.
Very unique, very meta situation. But thanks again for all the support throughout the bracket. Today, we're going to talk about a few loose end topics. What have we learned so far this draft season? Because this weekend, for those who play in the NFBC main event, live events are picking up in Vegas. You're probably seeing tweets and different things from people who are landing and getting excited about their various events. I am not playing in the main event this year. I'm playing in the auction championship instead, kind of the main event equivalent, but with the salary cap format. That draft's 2 weeks from Thursday, so I've got some time to still prepare, or maybe it's 2 weeks from Wednesday.
I don't. I'm doing my first main tonight. And that's partially why I'm coming to you live from outside my bathroom. I think the best move today is to not leave the house and get all my work stuff done, prepare, maybe run, eat well, and be prepared for the biggest, highest stakes draft I've ever been in.
Yeah, it's going to be strange, I think, as you sit down. You've done hundreds of fantasy baseball drafts in your life, and I think you're going to feel that extra little bit of pressure, at least at the beginning. I think as each pick comes up for those first few rounds, there's more of a sweat than usual because of the stakes involved. But it's also one of those drafts where people are more aggressive about getting their guys in NFBC main events than they are in any other snake draft that you play in, because of the aforementioned stakes, and because it is that last chance to really kind of put your flag in the ground and say, I believe in this player. And I'm seeing some pretty interesting trends. I built this ADP movers report where I can look at changes from month to month throughout draft season. And once we get to this point in the season, now I've got a week to week sort of change. So you can see it on more of a micro level and track who's really going up. And my goal for that is to have a better understanding of where I would actually have to go to get one of the rising players, right? Sometimes players are rising, but they're not rising fast enough. Sometimes players fall and they don't fall enough, or they fall too much, and taking advantage of that is something that I'm trying to actually do. But a broader question for you, you've gone through a few different drafts, a lot of different formats so far. We've seen more than a week's worth of spring training games. You're in Arizona right now, so you've had a chance to be around a few teams while you've been there. what have you learned this draft season? What is there anything about your approach or things you've noticed in the player pool with categories, anything at all that has really kind of changed for you over the course of the last, let's say, 3.5 or 4 months now?
I think there's two things that have sort of occurred to me. This, one has to do with steals and one has to do with innings. And when it comes to steals, the auction calculator does look at scarcity. It does try to pump up steals as a category. It does try to give you the relative value of every category, and it should, in theory, value players across the board. But what I found is that players without speed, without steals, are consistently the best, quote unquote, value by the calculator at the top of my board and remain there longer than anybody else. So, I mean, there's two ways to react to that. One is to just pay the speed tax like everybody else, or two, and I tried to just pay less tax than everybody else and do the handful of steals approach from everybody, because you seem to pay less for guys who will steal 8 bases relatively than you will for guys who steal 20. However, there's another approach, which is try to get a lot of steals in the first 2 rounds with your players so that you are ready to grab a falling Kyle Schwarber or whoever it is, JD Martinez later, because you feel like you had a solid base in steals. So there's 2 ways to react to that, but that's definitely something I've seen in terms of just a lot of speedless players at the top of my queue, wondering how long they will stay there.
Yeah, I think it forces you to make a decision. At least snake drafts in particular force you to decide if you're actually going to overpay for saves or if you're going to overpay for steals. And in a lot of leagues that our listeners play in, a lot of other leagues that we play in outside of the NFBC, we can make trades. So if we don't have the saves and steals that we need coming out of the draft, we're not necessarily stuck only churning on the waiver wire, only bidding against everybody else in the league for those same players via fab to get what we need. If you've got to make a choice up top of which one you're more likely to pay the tax for, is it speed or is it saves at this point?
It's speed. I just think that there's research behind this. There's just more saves on the wire every year. I mean, there's still a wire in this one. It's not a draft and hold. There's still going to be FAB. There's still going to be pickups during the season. And I think, the proof is pretty obvious. There are new closers minted every year. Of course, there's a cost of having to use your auction money to chase those. But just imagine having no speed and be trying to watch the waiver wire for speed. It's awful. It's no better there than it is in the draft. So, maybe you get lucky and some guy gets a call up and he has some speed, but then you're in the same pool with everybody else who's low on steals. At least with saves, you can speculate. You have a bench spot. I usually try to have a bench spot where I have someone that's behind a shaky closer so that I don't have to spend a huge FAB on it. It's just a one spot on my bench that's just going to be always somebody I'm speculating on and try to own him before he becomes the closer. So with that in mind, dedicated a bench spot, a little bit of FAB, I feel like I can cobble together a bullpen and be fine with it.
Yeah, and I think I have found that a lot of the players that return significant value within their projection in the stolen base category, a lot of those players come with significant downside either in other categories or with their hold on playing time. I think it leads you to rely a lot more heavily on players like Akil Baddoo, Ahmed Rosario. They're good players. They may end up being guys that go earlier in drafts a year from now than they're going right now.
Or they may lose their jobs.
But they definitely have that concern. I think in Baddoo's case, it's just a case of how much does he play against lefties? How crowded does that depth chart get with other young players all jockeying for playing time? And how patient will they be if he goes through another stretch of growing pains? I think he showed us a lot as a Rule 5 pick last year, to the point where he looks a little safer than a lot of other players that tend to fall in this range. But usually when you're looking in that pick 150 to 200
he's a
range,
fast riser. He's going up.
Yeah, he's starting to creep up a little bit too. So I think that willingness to overpay, if you have to overpay for speed, does make a lot of sense. Initially, this draft season, I wanted to get 2 great closers. I was willing to pay the saves tax a month, 2 months ago, and it seems like more and more people are just pushing closers up even further. And I think it's hit this breaking point where I can't bring myself to get 2 anymore. I might still be able to get 1 depending on snake draft order, depending on dynamics if we're talking about a salary cap situation.
But
But
in
it's
a
almost
snake
like
right now, you're talking about spending like a second-round pick and a fourth-round pick to get 2 top closers.
right. And when it
That's
was a
rough.
3rd and a 5th or a 4th and a 6th, that was a little easier to do. And I think now that opportunity cost has finally become too high for me to go ahead and pay the premium for 2 at least, maybe even pay for 1. But I think I've shifted my approach a little bit just because of how the room has been so
There's all
aggressive.
sorts of, I mean, just with closers, there's all sorts of risks associated with every player. So every player has an injury risk, right? And every player has a fallback risk of like, and then there's every player has some amount of losing their job risk. However, the hitters that you're normally picking up there do not have the same lose your job risk as closers. It's just not, it's not comparable in any way. And so so a lot of times you talk about floor and ceiling. Like if you take a player in the 5th round, it's mostly like the worst case scenario is he doesn't give you a great season, right? But he still plays. And so he gives you something, right? With a closer, it's just so all or nothing. It's like either he gives you exactly what you wanted or he gives you 0, like he's on the wire. And I don't like if you look at who stays on your roster, like in TGFBI, I've seen some analysis of like who stays on your roster all year. What you see is the first 5 rounds, you have kind of like an 80% stayed on your roster all the season. First round is something like 90% stay on your roster all season. Then when you get past the first 5 and the first 10 rounds, you start getting like 40% on your roster all season, 60% on your roster all season. That's where I want to take the all or nothing chances because it's okay. With teams that win have players in those slots that don't make it to the end. So I don't want to spend a pick where he could be on my roster. It could be an 80% on my roster all year pick, and I pick it on a closer who loses his job or gets hurt or whatever it is.
Looking at some of the ADP risers, I did this on the Athletic Fantasy Baseball podcast with Al Melchior, focusing more on bigger shifts, February to March. Now that I'm looking at the last 7 days, we're getting a snapshot of just how much of a discount you'll get on an injured Fernando Tatis Jr. and how much the premium is going to be on Chris Bryant in Colorado. And I think Tatis is one of those really format dependent players for me because what you just said about the first round, 90+% of those players sticking on your roster all year, the ones that don't got hurt. They had a devastating injury and they got dropped. That's it. There's not I can't remember a single first rounder in the entire time I played fantasy baseball who was so bad by like mid-season that people were cutting them based on merit, right? So
yeah, right.
The reason you cut these players, I think, moves down a little bit. Now, I think with Tatis is in a situation that you're in this evening where there's no IL spots and you have to burn a precious bench spot for the first probably 2 months of the season, is getting Tatis around pick 60, end of the 4th round, beginning of the 5th round. Is that enough of a discount to go through the hassle of playing shorthanded and navigating those problems on your roster? Because I think what it's going to do is going to force you, if you're the person that wants to build around Tatis in a format like that, I think it's going to make you be a lot more aggressive with multi-position players because your bench is a little bit thinner for the first 2 months, and you're probably going to have to be careful about the number of players you're trying to stream on your pitching perspective too. So I just think a lot of other pieces have to be right in the construction if you want to take advantage of that discount. And then there's the question of whether or not that's enough of a discount for the time missed and the player you expect him to be coming off of a wrist injury.
I don't want to tip my hand, but I don't think I'll join in. One thing that bothers me is that there is a little bit of a statistical risk once he even comes back, because after he injured his shoulder last year, he really stopped stealing. And so, that is a risk, I think, also with like, Ronald Acuna Jr. Like there's a risk that it does seem like the timeline's getting better. And like, now it's only maybe 2 weeks he's going to miss before he comes back in DHs. But will he steal bases coming off of the ACL? And if he doesn't, then he's a different profile. So what if you take that risk, you play shorthanded for 2 months to get Tatis back, and then he's kind of like a 270 hitter and he hits you like 20 homers and steals you like 5 bags, then you're just like, wow, I did all that for that, And also, I just, from my experience, the first mistakes I ever made on NFBC, the first year I didn't do that well, and mostly it was because I thought I could nurse a bunch of people on my bench, and I think the bench is for short-term injuries and for streamers, and for save speculation is a better use of your bench than holding on to someone who's injured for a really long time.
Yeah, I think whatever difference there is in analytical ability for managers in the NFBC compared to managers in other leagues, like I'm sure there is a difference. I don't know how to quantify it. I think the greater difference in those leagues versus the other broader pool of leagues that are out there is the number of people who miss out on maximizing playing time in your league is much smaller. People don't miss deadlines. They don't miss fab pickups. They don't miss volume.
And
And I
they're
think,
all drafting for innings and plate appearances. They're all like thinking very hard about that.
right, the in-season grind is, I think, what makes it exponentially harder. I think the rooms are tougher on draft day than a lot of other leagues, most leagues, for sure. But I think it's a that gap to me is even smaller than the one between in-season play in those leagues versus others. So I think it's a costly lesson that I think a lot of us coming from other places learned within a year or two of playing the NFBC. We thought, oh yeah, we were fine. We can have a prospect. We can have two prospects. We can have an injured pitcher and an injured hitter. We only need three bench guys because we've been able to play in other leagues like that in the past and get away with it. Not really the case here. There's other reasons players have actually dropped that aren't injury related. One of the more interesting ones for me is the discount on Jesse Winker, because he kind of fits the description of the players you were talking about earlier. He doesn't steal bases. He is a good hitter, but his park situation got worse from a homer's perspective at the very least, right? Great American Ballpark, three-year rolling average, best
Might be
ballpark for home runs.
more, yeah, might also be more platoonable on the new team.
Maybe. That's possible. They've got more depth in Seattle than what the Reds have. So I look at the discount on Winker. He's fallen about a round in the last 7 days, about 13 picks. Is like that enough of a discount to account for that park factors change? Because I liked Winker a lot in Cincinnati, and now I'm looking at that, and I'm still not sure that's enough of an adjustment.
I'm not sure it's enough because the biggest thing that'll be robbed of him is batting average, and that's the thing that makes him something other than a power threat. You know, in Cincinnati, I think he was a 290 hitter type guy, and now in Seattle, he might be a 275 hitter. Now, 275 is still above your benchmark in these leagues is 260 or something, 261. But it's not as far above that you can be like, oh, I'll pair Winker with Gallo or something. Like, it's not enough. It's more of a guy who can just like push your team batting average up a point or two, you know, as opposed to a guy who could like really cover somebody for you. So I think that removes his thing, and he becomes a little bit more like other kind of no steals sluggers that are out there.
Gleyber Torres has slipped a little bit recently, and I'm kind of surprised by that. I think you and I both like him anyway, so there's reason to be interested.
Stole a
even
base.
If the price hadn't fallen.
I stole a base in the spring game the other day. I don't know if that matters. Just this is a thing. He did it.
I've limited what I think matters in spring training is
It's
previously injured players being healthy, like velocity, new pitches, and what those look like. It's very granular, but it's almost just like error checking a lot of things. I was wondering about this yesterday.
I used to care about plate appearances a lot, but I've sorted by plate appearance recently and was looking at some stuff, and it's not the best players. It's just the guys who are on the brink the most. It's the 26th man who's, you know, the 25th through 28th men. They're getting the most plate appearances right now. So yeah. I would be that, like, I wouldn't be like, oh, look, Elehuris Montero leads the Cactus League in plate appearances.
Right. That doesn't necessarily
make the roster, but he doesn't mean he's got a role.
I do think prioritizing players in a way to get a look at them is probably what teams are doing at this time of the year. Or if they've got a player maybe who's a little behind, they want to lead him off unexpectedly just to make sure that he gets the extra plate appearance in a game situation. Like those little things do make a difference. I've started to wonder if the bottom of the order tells us something about how much a team has actually soured on a player. And the example of that, I was jokingly saying Victor Robles is going to be the best number 9 hitter we've ever seen because the Nats threw out a lineup on Wednesday. They had him 9th. They had him behind Alcides Escobar. I think they had him behind Lane Thomas. They buried him, right? It's like if you see him as being less important to prioritize in the pecking order to make sure he maximizes plate appearances compared to those other guys, maybe that does actually mean something. And I'm going to call it the Travis Demerit effect, because I went to a spring training game. Jesus, was probably 2 springs ago now. One of the last spring training games we saw that year was a Yankees-Tigers game. And at the time, I thought, oh, Demerit's kind of on the rostered bubble. They've got spots available. He was hitting 9th in the lineup that day. And that was to me, that was the signal of, yeah, we're not really looking at him as a part of the major league roster. He's more of an organizational filler.
What is the biggest thing that lineup slot does for you? It's more plate appearances.
Yeah.
So more looks.
Yeah, more looks. More looks means we want to see more of you.
More looks against
we don't.
The better starter on the other team too,
mm-hmm.
Right? Like even in spring, where like maybe everyone just gets 3 plate appearances, the 9th hitter might not get another plate appearance, that 3rd plate appearance against the starter, or even the 2nd one, early on. So it does mean something.
And maybe in this case, they want to see more of Escobar and Thomas and some of those guys to understand how they prioritize playing those guys in various position battles. Maybe they know Robles is their center fielder and he's a bottom third of the order guy to start the season regardless, but they want to sort out the rest. Maybe that's possible, but I do think it's possible to try and get inside the head of a team and understand some things that they think about a player based on their priorities within spring training.
But another thing that actually fits under this header, that was the other thing that that I've been learning that I didn't get to yet, was innings. And it's injury risk. It's a draft day discount. It's a very format specific thing. But like the no speed slugger that's sitting around and just like available at any time, the 120 inning pitcher is like becoming a difficult decision for me, especially if I think that they have a lot of talent, and especially if I think they're going to start the season in rotation. So, there's plenty of Rays that fit this box. There's other pitchers where you're like, but they're going to get injured, or how much, Means or Keedy. There's these high injury risk guys that will start the season in the rotation. They're falling because everyone's trying to buy innings. And I understand that, but I would have to say, and I would love to have, Jeff pop in right here, and like Jeff Zimmerman, and like, answer this one. But I know from talking to Jeff that this is the beginning, at least publicly, of injury projection as more of a science. And so if we are okay at projecting players by like quality and like what they're going to do, we're years behind in trying to project their injury risk, and so like just thinking about when to take these guys, I find them to be values a lot. And I think we overestimate our own ability to understand injury risk. And so if I'm like, if the guy's throwing right now and he looks all right, and like, we don't have an injury note on him right now, are you sure that your guy, has a bunch of no injury risk and my guy has injury risk? Like, are you sure your guy's going to make it through the season and my guy's not, And so the only thing is to just sort of balance that and make sure that you do kind of get grabbed from each bucket. But I do think that there are values sitting there of like sort of players that people think are higher injury risk that maybe we overestimate our ability to understand how high that injury risk actually is.
Yeah, I've seen so many tweets over the years where I think people are well-intentioned in trying to just to get it right. I don't think it's all this. I don't think it's all about, I want to be right at the end of the year. I think I'm trying to understand risk, and I'm trying to explain to other people how I think about risk. And I think we struggle with those terms because a lot of people don't think like, I don't know, an actuarial scientist, for example, right? Like that's more in line with how you have to properly quantify and assess these situations. And that's just not the background that most people have. So this is a space where I feel like Ariel Cohen and Ruvain Guy, they host a podcast together. Ruvain has an injury background, and Ariel, of course, is an actual actuary. Like they, I think, are the kinds of combinations that could work together and find something that is a little bit more detailed,
like
but
regimented.
Also, But it
I mean,
also needs to
that's
be
what
easy
Jeff
to
ended up
understand.
doing in the end, is looking at each pitcher and like doing it by hand and doing it by like finding comps for each pitcher.
Yeah.
The more effort you put into this space, I do think there's more reward, but I think it's a nascent science kind of, at least in fantasy, you know.
I feel like I'm just wandering around in the dark with a flashlight with pitching injuries a lot of times. I think even just maybe 2 years ago, Nathan Eovaldi was a complete ignore for me just because of the history of arm injuries and what he'd shown us. And maybe it's a complete fallacy on my part, but
Maybe it's going
after
to come back. Maybe everyone thinks this year he's good at innings, and now,
that's
there it is.
but that's the thing. It's like, am I wrong for being coming off of the 182 innings a year ago, or am I right because his arm showed us last year? Like, he can stay healthy, he can do it. He can have the velocity, he can do it with control, he can keep the ball in the park, he can do all the things we need him to do to be a good fantasy starter. I think that's a really difficult thing for us to assess from the outside without a detailed understanding of all these injuries and their mechanisms and the long-term effects. Like, it's almost impossible. But I do think what we're seeing in San Francisco, what we've seen in Los Angeles with the Dodgers for a little while with injury risk, I think it kind of is an agreement to what you're pointing at. Like, Matthew Boyd's deal with San Francisco, right? Grant Brisbee had a great piece for The Athletic about that. And there's an old Mitch Hedberg joke where he says, a friend asked me if I wanted a frozen banana. And I said, no, but I want a regular banana later. So yeah. And you can take that joke. Like, think about it. Like, so what Grant did in the piece, this is brilliant. This is all Grant. This is not my joke. So if you're laughing now, you're laughing because Grant's awesome. Grant basically said, my friend asked me if I wanted an injured pitcher. And I said, no. But then I said, I want a healthy pitcher later. So yeah. And that's what they're doing, because, like, if you have guys like Rodon and Alex Wood, and you have this in Logan Webb, even, I know they didn't go out and acquire him, they already had him. But if you have this really risky group of pitchers and they're good when healthy, and the when healthy part is the key, and they're healthy right now, you're thinking about your roster and saying, they're probably not all going to be healthy later. Well, where can I get a good pitcher who's going to be healthy later? I can get a guy who's hurt right now. And, we know enough at that level. They know enough about injury outcomes and what's likely to happen and how quickly guys come back. They have the medical experts in their corner. They can appropriately assess that risk and take those chances. So if and when one or multiple starters in that Giants rotation are hurt later this season, they'll eventually have a good starter at the ready in Matthew Boyd, right? So that sort of concept, I think, does really check out. And I think for us as fantasy players, if you're in a league with limited IL spots or no IL spots, you can't play it quite like this because you can't afford to hold
Forever.
injured players when they go down. I think the best example, or the most difficult example of all this and your risk tolerance, comes back to Jacob deGrom. Do you really want Jacob deGrom at the end of round one, which is probably where he's going to go throughout the weekend, if not a little earlier, because he's apparently healthy this spring. Healthy right now is what matters to most people. And it's just a question of, will he stay healthy? And are you comfortable with that risk at that price compared to, say, guys that have much lower ceilings, like Luis Severino, who I do like where he's going around pick 140 or 150. My approach has been, be very careful with deGrom, see what happens this spring. He's doing the things this spring that I think he needs to be doing for me to be comfortable. And now I have to decide if I'm on board with the inflated price when the moment actually shows up. It's one thing to say you'll do it later if he's healthy, and then he shows you he's healthy, and then the clock's ticking down, and you're choosing between deGrom and a hitter with seemingly less health risk, right? So that deGrom's like the most extreme example of this. I have found I'm much more willing to take those chances on Severino and Kershaw, or even Verlander. Verlander at pick 75 seems, because of the cost, less problematic to me than deGrom, even though I know you can get deGrom at pick 15 and end up with literally the most valuable player in the pool.
Yeah, and it has something to do with the part, I think, that ports over from what the Giants do to fantasy is the idea of what's your replacement. So, like, they can sign Rodon to this big deal because they have Carlos Martinez, Matt Boyd, Jake Junis. They've improved the replacement level on their own team. you know? And so I think that at the lower end, where your investment is lower and you get your reward is a good pitcher, but your investment is lower, that means that the replacement for that investment will just be a pitcher you get off the wire, right? So if you are talking pick 200, something like that, then I think you can replace that guy. The problem is when you're talking pick 14, pick 16, those are the guys who are supposed to be on your roster 80%, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be hard to you're not going to find a DeGrom, and you're just hoping I get like 110 innings. Like he can win it. Like Kershaw won Cy Youngs with like 140, 150 innings, right? Like DeGrom could be so excellent in 120 innings that it makes it all worth it. So that's where it actually gets tougher for me, because he could be that excellent that as long as you get the 120 innings up front, that it's fine. But yeah, I just have a harder time when the investment is that big, because the replacement for that kind of investment is not on the wire. But the replacement for like a Luis Severino investment is on the wire. It's another guy, could be Luis Heel.
Yeah.
Severino goes down, Heel comes up. There's lots of things to like about Heel.
Yeah, so I think the thing that I have learned over the course of this draft season as it pertains to pitchers coming back from injuries is that the sweet spot tends to be no earlier than where Verlander goes, and probably is really around the Severino, Kershaw, Mike Clevenger, Noah Syndergaard range, for the reasons that you're mentioning. If you have to go out and replace those guys, I also think you're less likely to hold them in the event of the dreaded 4-week injury. Like the 4-week injury is the most frustrating timetable you can get for a player, where you'll sit there and you'll try to talk yourself into it. You say, it's only 4 weeks. I can play short for 4 weeks. And 4 weeks turns into 6, or there's a setback and it turns into 8, or the initial diagnosis was wrong, or there's so many.
I don't
so many
like
times
taking currently injured pitchers. That I think is a distinction that matters.
Yes,
right. I like taking them if they're injury risk, then fine, later I'll give up. But if they're currently injured, that's just a dead bench spot or just a dead roster spot that you're just looking at. It changes a little bit unlimited IL or like large IL, and that's I have a home league like that.
And I've long kind of had this spot where I would say I would take more of these players in leagues with multiple IL spots, and I'll take an even greater number of these players in leagues that are more shallow. If you play in an 8-team mixed league or a 10-team mixed league,
where you have to,
as much as you improve the replacement level on the wire by making the league smaller, the more likely it is that you'll find a suitable replacement for nothing in season.
And then you just have to be all about ceiling.
Players.
8 and 10 team leagues, just all you need is ceiling. They're not going to hit that ceiling, then move on.
I think the hardest thing, if you take this approach, is deciding in season, when am I not getting enough from some of those guys who flashed that previously high ceiling, right? If Clevenger or any of those guys, or Syndergaard, Severino,
is mediocre
Kershaw,
for a little bit, like how long am I going to wait?
One month of a 4.50 ERA, and maybe.
Well, I have good news for you. Stuff Plus is pretty good in that.
You're right. The Stuff Plus is the.
I mean, I think that matters.
The guide here.
It tells you something in 300, 400 pitch in games, 300, 400 pitches. That's 3-4 games that like maybe they're mediocre, but their stuff and location are good. Then I'm holding. If their stuff and location are no good,
then you can fear that they're still hurt, or they've had to compensate by changing their mechanics, or they've lost something from the time off.
Still working on some sort of thing at the Athletic. May happen.
The other problem pitcher in the pool came up about 2 weeks ago, I think, on the show, Shane Bieber. And we got an email from another one of our listeners who sent us some pretty interesting stuff from a medical journal. I wish I knew exactly which medical journal it was. And basically, it was questioning, I think what we said on the show was that after reading some analysis from Nick Savali that wrote the original piece, Nick's piece was saying that the nature of Bieber's injury in the subscapularis last season was less concerning than other shoulder injuries, where people might have it's a shoulder injury, I'm staying away, right? And
I think we were maybe guilty of a little bit of inexact language where I sort of suggested it wasn't part of the labrum. It might be part of the labrum, but I think it might also not be like labrum fraying or a labrum tear that requires surgery in the way that we think of labrums. It's like a slightly different part of the labrum.
Right.
That's how I understand it now.
So What we were presented with, though, was some data that was looking at just how much strain, essentially, how much work is being done by each part of the shoulder in various parts of pitching. So, wind up, arm acceleration, deceleration. It was broken down into about 6 categories, and that research did not agree with the idea that this would be less problematic. So, I found that to be really interesting.
The part that he hurt was still very important for
based on this particular bit of research, and
that's interesting.
So again, it's, and I'm not trying.
This is what we're reduced to.
I'm not trying to throw
this
Nick
is
under
what it's
the bus
like
at
to
all.
try and predict injuries.
No,
fantasy baseball.
Right,
reading medical journals.
All of this is to say, like, I think with Bieber, what you want to see in spring training is similar to what you want to see with DeGrom, where he's cruising through, he's getting those reactions, the velo's there. The debut from Bieber yesterday was only 1 1/3 innings, give a couple of home runs, one to Gavin Lux and a moonshot to Miguel Vargas, who has been impressive.
Vargas. Yeah,
it's one spring outing. I'm not just writing off Bieber because of one spring outing. I still haven't found velo. I was looking around last night on Twitter and for articles with velo, couldn't find anything. But I do think a pitcher like Bieber is also really problematic because he's not showing the way DeGrom is right now in spring training. And we're only going to have a few looks before more and more drafts happen.
Too, right? It's a decently high pick still.
He goes right around where the early closers go. So you're thinking about Bieber versus either Hader or Hendricks, or you're thinking about him compared to some speed guys, Whit Merrifield, Tim Anderson. I mean, that's a really good spot.
Yeah.
So I'm finding right now I'm not there on Bieber. And if it costs me, if he's good and healthy and someone gets a deal 5 or 10 picks after that ADP, I'm going to have to live with that.
Yeah, I haven't drafted him once.
So all that's to say, it's just the nightmare of trying to sift through details and trying to figure out where exactly guys are at. But
but compared to Sale, who probably goes similar place, maybe Sale's a little bit dropping now, but compared to Sale, at least Bieber's pitching now, right? Like we just talked about this, like.
Yeah, being out there is better than not being out there for sure. Sales discount, by the way, is pretty steep. How much
where has he dropped to now?
Last 7 days, Chris Sale has fallen to. Why is it the control? You ever have this problem happen in a spreadsheet where you drop in a name, hit Control F, and it goes to a different part of the sheet, but it does not highlight the actual name that you're looking for?
Yeah, I have noticed that.
Not cool. Not cool. Okay, I wish I had an answer for you, but apparently the spreadsheet is failing me. Spreadsheets, what you get for being so dependent on numbers all the time. Here he is. Pick 126 is where he's going now. That's the discount.
That's a big discount.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was like a 4th, 5th rounder.
Yeah, the ADP just a week ago, like the first week before we knew he was hurt, ADP was about pick 69. So he's dropped 60 spots almost from there.
It is a fracture, but it's a stress fracture. Let's play this game again.
Nope, not. Let's play a game that we're actually maybe a little better at. The trade game. Randal Grichuk is now a Rocky. Raimel Tapia is now a Blue Jay as part of a trade. A couple other players were
I'm a little disappointed
as well.
I actually had shares of Tapia, and this bothers me because I don't think he's a good player. And yet I did it because I was like, hey, like I did one where I have Ramon Laureano and I had to cover for him. So I had Tapia and I was like, well, the Rockies are home a lot in the first 3 weeks. So like, I'll just play Tapia and then drop him when Laureano's back or whatever. And I thought it was a brilliant plan and, wrenched my shoulder out, patting myself on the back. But this is always the risk with not great players. So I think that his role in Toronto is, he's a lefty. They wanted a lefty. So there is a chance that he gets a big side of a platoon. But there's also a very large chance that he's the 4th outfielder and just very much a sort of replacement, like lefty bench bat.
Yeah, if you look at how they're currently set up between outfield and DH, maybe there's another addition coming. Roster resource puts Lourdes Gurriel in left, Teoscar Hernandez in right, George Springer, of course, in center, and then Alejandro Kirk as the regular DH. I don't know how firm they are on Kirk DHing a certain percentage of the time versus catching. I think this is one of the harder things to figure out with Toronto right now is how do they quantify and value their catching options between Danny Jansen, Kirk, eventually Gabriel Moreno, Reese McGuire's on the depth chart right now as a backup. You can hold 3 catchers if one of them is a regular DH for you. This looks like a situation where there's still one more move to come to me. So for the moment, you could probably talk yourself into 500 plate appearances for Raimel Tapia, but I don't think that's necessarily going to hold up. And I think you also have questions just about the core skills, right? So much of what he does comes from stolen bases and maybe batting average, and not being in Colorado probably brings that batting average floor down a bit too.
Yeah, I wonder what could be left. Brett Gardner's a free agent.
And I thought I saw something in the trade
Ooh.
rumors or some kind of tweet that was
What about
linking
Jed
Gardner there.
Lowry?
Maybe.
That's not crazy. That would be an interesting one because he can play a little second where they're weak, makes Espinal more of a thing, and then you basically have a DH that's Lowry and Kirk. And if there's an outfielder that's injured or doesn't want to play the field, something with his arm or something, you can rotate them in. I don't know. I could see there being one more move. I don't think that any team really wants to hold 3 catchers, and I think this looks like a rotating DH situation where if they could shore up one more position with a left-handed bat, that specifically I think is the need, then they'll send McGuire down.
The current bench is Reese McGuire, Greg Bird, Santiago Espinal, and Tapia. I
think I would want to improve on that Greg Bird spot.
Yeah, he's there on an NRI too, so not necessarily committed to him at all. But my takeaway here is that if you are drafting right now, yes, the Jays have a lot of expensive players with a couple of first rounders, but if you can get secondary guys in terms of their ADPs, you can get Springer, Teoscar Hernandez is also expensive, kind of a top 30 guy. More like Gurriel and Chapman. Those guys are going to play a lot. That's not a very good bench. That's not a bench that's going to push the starters for playing time. It's a great lineup, so your counting stats are going to be good. So I'm comparing them to, say, the Dodgers with the depth they've accumulated. They always have.
Yeah, they don't quite have that sort of Dodger depth.
Right, you're knocking down the ceiling for some of those other players in the Dodgers lineup. You're not really doing that with Toronto right now as they're built.
Yeah, so it is interesting. I didn't think that there was a weakness. I thought they were fully formed and ready to go, and I really like them as a team. But yeah, I think that it's a little bit weak to have Bird and a catcher, an extra catcher on your on your depth chart. So over in Denver, I think there's a clear winner. I do think that Randal Grichuk probably just slides right into center field and is the starter there, and that pushes Sam Hilliard to a reserve role, I believe. And Connor Joe's situation gets a little bit tougher. He becomes more of a platoon bat at first and DH in left field. But I do think he gets more playing time than Sam Hilliard, despite what the depth charts currently say.
So the Rockies were a top 10 team in runs scored back in 2019. I know last year was a pretty disastrous season for them offensively. I mean, Story having a down year, trading away Arenado. There were plenty of factors in play there. And they still, last season, I believe, were 11th in runs scored. I think people might be sleeping on the quality of their offense again. And I think Grichuk was,
at least for fantasy purposes, I think.
Yeah.
In real life purposes, once you adjust for that park, it's not a very good.
Right. For our purposes, Randal Grichuk, very undervalued during his time in Toronto, just because he's not a sabermetrically pleasing offensive profile, but high volume of playing time.
Really hard. I mean, he's a barrel guy. There is some sabermetrics that like him.
You're going to put a barrel guy in Colorado in the top 6 of a lineup that should be another top 10 offense this year.
Might float his batting average a little bit.
Yep. I think it takes one of the categorical weaknesses and fixes that. This is a great thing for Randal Grichuk's value, as it often is for a player going to Colorado.
Yeah, I think he goes from not draftable to draftable for sure.
I think he might have been one of your last outfielders on the bench in a 15-teamer previously. Now you're almost excited to have him as, a 4th outfielder when you start 5 in a 15-teamer, and probably your 5th outfielder in a 12.
The one thing that you have to caution, though, he fits in that thing we're talking about where it's speedless. So, and a lot of times you're trying to find guys who have 5'10" speeds, 5'10" steals at the speeds,
Like bicycles.
bicycles on the bottom of your outfield roster, because that's where it's kind of easy to find some guys. So he doesn't fit that. So I think he might stick around as a value. You might be able to pick him with a bench spot and maybe pair him. Actually, a Grichuk Tapia pairing at the sort of 5-6 outfielder spot in a 15-teamer is still a little bit appealing to me.
I'm convinced the Jays have another move up their sleeve. If they
and that
don't,
would make Tapia worse.
Yeah, if they don't, then I think Tapia remains pretty interesting because there should be a little bit of a drop for him leaving Colorado. Although that might be offset by expectations of the Jays lineup being elite this year too. So maybe there won't be as much movement there as I thought. Tommy Pham has a team. It's the Reds. I actually think they needed outfield help because they've got a ton of injury risk in their outfield. As much as I like Nick Senzel as a very inexpensive late dart, someone that could be their everyday center fielder and has quietly improved his plate skills in very limited time around the injuries. They have him and they have Tyler Naquin, who's got a pretty ugly history of knee injuries. Plus, Jake Fraley, as much as the power speed combo is enticing, there's no reason to believe that he's necessarily going to be a everyday sort of guy. He's probably more of a big side platoon guy. So here's Tommy Pham now going to Cincinnati, getting a nice park boost for homers, still showing a little bit of cheap speed late. I'm just curious to know, like, how much is he going to jump in terms of price? Because he was a bargain without a team, and now I feel like there's going to be some overcorrection thanks to that ballpark.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I'm a big fan of his, and we have a bunch of shares, which I'm happy for those shares. But like, there's a big draft tonight. I think you were pushing back on Naquin, saying that he was a decent outfielder. When I had maybe disparaged his name. So, I think it probably goes Pham, Senzel, Naquin, Fraley. And then DH becomes an Aquino Moran, not moron.
No.
Situation out there. So Shogo Akiyama is a fairly big loser here. He might have had some time, but he has not hit a homer. He's not hit a homer since he came over, and I think he has 2 barrels.
He's got a 63 WRC plus in 366 plate appearances. And I'd realized debuting in 2020, we talked about, I think, with Yoshi Tsugo, not optimal to make the move to a new league in a new country in 2020. Didn't fare much better last season. He walked less and he struck out more than he did in his first season. I don't think he's a big league hitter, unfortunately. I think he's got options left. He might be sent on a AAA. He might just be the kind of guy that gets $7 million to play at the AAA level at Louisville all season.
Yeah, it's a tough spot for him, especially since Fraley's pretty versatile and can probably play center. And that's and Naquin's played some center. So you already have 2 guys that can play center. And that's one of the big questions. That's one of the questions that might keep him on the roster, right? Like, do I have a backup center fielder? Do I have a backup shortstop? Do I have a backup catcher? Those like the first 3 things, people ask when they're talking about a bench player. And in this case, Shogo's defensive ability in center does not help him much.
Who would you rather have for this season if the price ends up being even? Tommy Pham or Avisail Garcia? I get the sense that you're building a little more often where you're in need of speed in that range, and Garcia runs a little, and Pham should run a little bit more. The only thing I'm thinking about with Pham is if he pops a few extra homers, that does take away a handful of stolen base opportunities, so it might not be as much of a gap as we've seen in that category for those 2 players in the past.
Both fairly close to, like 270, 2010. I do think that the batting average will be worse for Garcia. He will be hurt in that category in that park. And so if he's projected more like 260. So if he's a 260, 28 guy and Pham is a 275, 19, 13 guy. Yeah, Pham.
Yeah, I'm looking at Pham from 17 to 18 to 19, up above 270 in average all those years, even popped a 306 average for us way back in 2017. So seeing
He
a
reminds me of
211.
Shin-Soo Choo
Oh, okay, like a Chew
statistically.
profile. Yeah, plenty of OBP,
A
slightly
little bit
lower average, you'd think.
too many grounders a little bit, but good speed. Yeah, he's got a lot of things in common with Shin-Soo Choo. Good reach rate, good sense of the plate, decent barrel rate. Yeah, very Chewian.
One thing I like about Pham right now is if you look at the Fangraphs projections for playing time, they come out lighter than they've been in all of the last 4 seasons. And I realize past health doesn't guarantee future health, but he might be losing a little bit of playing time on the margins right now in the projections, which would be bringing down those counting stats slightly. So I could see if people are just running him through an auction calculator, just using those numbers and not adjusting upwards to 550 or possibly even 600 plate appearances, there could still be a little bit of a discount or at least fair value when it comes to Pham in drafts over these next few days.
The Bad X uses a lot of Statcast stats, and he had good barrel rates and some good underlying numbers last year. And the Bad X he's going to be 19% better than league average. And then the Bad X for other Cincinnati hitters, it only has Joey Votto is better than that, and then India is sort of right there with them. Senzel, Naquin, and Moustakas are basically league average. Who are you going to play over Tommy Pham? So I think he's a regular.
I think they play him as much as you physically can because
Fraley
he
is
makes
the
your
guy you
offense
move
better.
around. Fraley is the guy who plays more when Senzel's down. Fraley's, pair him maybe with Naquin, although they're both lefties, or push one to DH or whatever. I think Fraley's you find him time, but you don't do it over the expense of Pham.
Very surprising signing, though, just given the shape of the Reds' recent moves. I thought they had a need for it. Didn't think they'd actually spend a little money, but they did.
The way someone described it down here is the Reds are stuck. They're stuck in between. They want to be competitive. They get attached to certain players and give them long-term extensions, but they also don't want to spend money.
One more email to get to. This one comes from Nick, and thank you to Dr. Tim for the email a bit earlier, focusing on Shane Bieber. Nick wants to know, with Tommy Edman, is there a world where you can imagine he keeps the leadoff position? He makes some good points in this email, most notably just that the OBP is very low for Tommy Edman, and they've got some alternatives that could take that spot in the lineup and move Edman maybe to the bottom third. So as they change with their more analytics forward manager, Ali Marmol, how likely do you think it is that Tommy Edman stays in that top spot?
They don't actually have a lot of good OBP projected on that team. So maybe they've got different analytics in the front office too. But I think the big improvement could be Dylan Carlson to the leadoff spot, because he's got a 330 projected OBP to Tommy Edman's 319. However, Carlson has a much better projected, not much better, but a better projected slugging percentage. And there are lineup effects you can discover by putting power in things like the 2, 3, and 4 spot. So I actually think it won't happen. I think it will still be Edman, and then maybe Carlson creeps up the batting order. But you've got Goldschmidt, O'Neill as probably the 2-3. So you go Edman, O'Neill, Goldschmidt. No, they've got Arenado. What's your lineup then? Edman. I think Edman, O'Neill, Goldschmidt, Arenado.
I think this is really,
Carlson.
really tough. I think you lead off Carlson. Maybe
there's also
about lefty
some
righty
value.
balance,
there's some value in the fifth. I think there was the fifth spot in particular to having a high contact rate. The idea that there might be more like players, you come up to bat with players on base more, and so just putting the ball in play is good. How much difference is there between first and fifth? Because I don't think Edman goes all the way down to eighth. He's not that terrible. He's like a league average bat. I think he would still bat around where Bader, maybe ahead of DeYoung. So I think that the question is first to fifth. If he does that, the change is 16 plate appearances per slot. So theoretically, if he were to get maybe 675, in a full season in the first spot, that full season would be more like 600 or 615 in the fifth spot.
Yeah, I think
it's meaningful, but like, how many people get to 675 anyway?
I think the thing that just puts Edman on thin ice, though, it was a 308 OBP, as Nick points out in the email from last season, and a 91 WRC plus. The projections are for something better than that. If he gets to the projection, then he's right in this cluster of other Cardinals that could all have a case for it. Dylan Carlson makes more sense to me if you want to just put your best non-masher among current bats in the spot.
Yeah.
If they play Lars Nootbaar more, Nootbaar's got a 320 projected OBP, so he's right there with Edman. Harrison Bader at 317 isn't far behind. He improved his plate skills last year.
Right.
So I wonder if the projection systems are maybe, well, they're kind of on what Bader did last year, but Bader showed a better walk rate in 2019 and 2020. I don't know. I think there's 2 or 3 different ways they could swap Edman out of that spot. If he lands middle third, maybe, but contact rate is good. Power is just so light. Like, I don't know if they would actually commit to him there. So I like the spirit of this email just because it seems like the kind of thing that when you look at the playing time volumes and the expectations, they could be erring on the high side because of something we saw Tommy Pham do back in his debut in 2019 that we really haven't seen him do in the 200 plus games from the last 2 seasons combined.
There's some simple math we can do where if it's cost him 60 plate appearances to drop down in the batting order, and he gets on base, a little bit less than a third of the time, then we're talking about he's on base 20 times less. So that would cost him what, 2-3 stolen bases?
Yeah, a few bags, opportunities to score runs.
Yeah. I'm not that in on Edman anyway, because it's I get nervous wanting to roster a player that projects to be worse than league average with the stick. But I mean, he's going to be in the lineup. I don't think they have a choice, really. I doubt that Sosa, pushes him off second base.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. Edman can move around enough to where the playing time volume, even if it comes down from where it has been, I don't think it's going to crater. I don't think we're going from 691 down to 500.
Is that where he was last year? I'm just looking at projections.
He got to 691 last year.
Right. So if he moves to fifth, but he's only projected, so if you're looking at a projected value for him in an auction calculator, he's only projected for 606. So there could be some of that risk baked in, right?
A small amount, partial risk baked in, like a handful of raisins if you're making muffins instead of 2 handfuls. Is that what you're doing? You're making muffins over there?
Oh, man, now you made me think about lunch.
Yeah, I barely just ate breakfast. We are on totally different time schedules, even though we are in the same time zone.
Because the stupid clubhouses are open at 7.
That's not good for anybody. We talked about that on the 3-0 show. You run your entire season based on a totally different body clock, and you run your training leading up to the season on its own like it's a totally own system. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
All right, one last question here. This one comes from Chris. It's about a pitcher that you and I both really like. Chris wants to know, in one of his 12-team keeper leagues, he has the option of keeping Shane McClanahan at a low cost. He was a very late pick last year. I want to believe he has ace potential. I know both of you are generally proponents of him, but looking at his StatCast page does raise concerns. His player profile page has a lot of blue on his X stats, barrel rates, and hard hit rates. Doing a very quick sample of Eno's top 25 starting pitchers shows an average 2021 barrels per plate appearance of 4.3 with a standard deviation in that 25 pitcher sample of 1.2. At 7% barrels per plate appearance, McClanahan is the worst in that group and 2 standard deviations worse than the average of the group. I would imagine this is due to a fastball with suboptimal movement, and to an extent, he's able to overcome it with high whiff rates on his arsenal. Are there historical comps of pitchers who have been elite with such hard hit rates and barrel rates, or is it very likely that McClanahan will struggle to be a consistent top 20 pitcher giving up this kind of hard contact?
I don't use that stat. I haven't seen it as predictive, and I just wanted to, just as an example, the leaders in barrel rate last year were Dylan Cease, Robbie Ray, Garrett Cole, Jose Barrios, Yu Darvish. I think Yu Darvish describes some of the risk, I guess. He gives up more homers than you'd expect. But this list is full of a lot of good pitchers. Sean Manaea is on. Max Scherzer is 15th in barrel rate allowed last year. Joe Musgrove was 17th. Walker Buehler was 20th. I don't find much value in it. And the reason is pitchers do have some control over launch angle, which we know because if you throw it high, the launch angles on those pitches are high. And if you throw it low, the launch angles on those are low. And so you could theoretically have some control over barrel, but there's not much evidence that they control the EV that well, the exit velocity. So basically, this is a list of fly ball pitchers, right? I mean, Dallas Keuchel's in there too, but there's a lot of fly ball pitchers on here.
I don't know. I'm looking at the barrels per plate appearance list, and I don't think this is necessarily the list you want to be on. Like maybe we're looking at different pages. I'm looking at that StatCast leaderboard and sorting by barrels over batted ball events in the percentage. Tarek Skubal is number one. This is just qualified pitchers. J Happ, Marco Gonzalez, Yusei Kikuchi, Blake Snell, Brad Keller, Shane McClanahan comes in 7th there. Colby Allard, Michael Wacha, John Means rounding out the top 10. Like that's to me not. You mentioned like Cease and Ray and Cole.
Barrel percentage on the StatCast leaderboard on Fangraphs.
Yeah, so I'm looking a little further down the list. Cease is at 15 on this list. Robbie Ray at 16. Cole at 17. Ian Anderson at 18.
I'm also doing qualified pitchers, maybe.
Maybe you've got a different filter on the qualifiers. Yeah, that's probably what the difference is. So there are good pitchers that are not that far down the list.
For example, like xWOBA for hitters does have some predictive qualities. The StatCast xWOBA, the expected WOBA, does have some predictive qualities for hitters. It has none for pitchers. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. This is like an xWOBA. It's barrel rates. That goes into the xWOBA for pitchers. And I know that one has been shown pretty repeatedly by different analysts that doesn't have predictive quality. So I think that, the pitchers have some control over launch angle, but they don't have that much control over exit velocity. And so these, there's some luck. You might be looking at some luck factors here.
Yeah, I think when you miss as many bats as some of the elite pitchers do, you can get by with this. It's kind of like the opposite problem of a hitter that strikes out too much, but does exponentially more damage than most when he makes contact. It's like a Tyler O'Neill sort of situation, but in the form of a pitcher. I think that's more or less what we're looking at.
Yeah, like Kyle Gibson is 4th in the smallest barrel rate allowed. And so I think there might be some command factors here because there are better command guys on the other side. But I'm not going to get Kyle Gibson because he has a low barrel rate.
Great question, though. And I think I'm going to look back at some previous years and see if anything catches my eye. If anything does jump out, we'll share that on a future episode. But thank you for that question. If you got a question for a future episode, email ratesandbarrels@theathletic.com or dropping a comment in under this video on YouTube would be the 2 best ways to get those in. Be sure to hit the like button on this video on YouTube if you are still watching, and be sure to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify if you haven't done so already. We really appreciate everybody who's done that. $1 a month for the first 6 months gets you a subscription to The Athletic. If you go to theathletic.com/ratesandbarrels on Twitter, you can find Eno at Eno Saris. You can find me at Derek Van Riper. Eno, good luck with your main event draft tonight. Good luck to everybody else listening out there who might be playing in those events over the course of this weekend. We are back with you on Monday.
Thanks for listening and voting.